Hi everyone, welcome to Strategies to Port Your Android and iOS app to Flutter. In this talk, I'm going to be talking about 5 different strategies that you can use to successfully port your existing Android and iOS app to Flutter. Those strategies are Audit Dependencies, Encapsulate business logic, user migration, analytics migration, and UI development. Now, if you think back to about 4 years ago when Flutter was first announced, I was sitting in the front row actually, and Eric Seidel got onto the stage and talked about Sky, which is, fun fact, a code name for Flutter. And he talked about Sky, and he talked about what they were doing and bringing, native Android and iOS development, native mobile app development using Flutter, using Dart, and then the framework became Flutter. Anyways, since that time on, I've been building tons and tons of Flutter apps. And it's been very exciting, greenfield apps, I click file, new project, build there, and it's a good time. Over time though, I start to realize that, wow, Flutter hits 1.0, Flutter hits 1.2, it's time now to actually start porting over my old apps as well as help other people out. And so I started getting a lot of customers or clients reach out to me and say, Faisal, we have a lot of apps right now that we want to bring to Flutter, and can you help us? And that was very exciting for me. So over the past 2 years, I've been helping multiple apps go to production by successfully porting over their Android and iOS. And these 5 techniques that I've listed out here are really it's part of my playbook now. It's kind of, I go in there and this is the algorithm I follow. Now you might say, Faisal, I see actually 6 there. 1 is 0. What is add to app? Why aren't you including add to app in this entire introduction? Well, I'll tell you why. So add to app, it's a simple way to integrate Flutter into existing applications. The easiest way to understand that is Flutter is a rendering engine, which means that you can take this rendering engine and put it into any Android activity, any UI view controller, and it just works. And so what you can do is you can take your existing Android app and imagine you're building a to-do app. The first 3 screens of your to-do app can be native Android. And then the 4th screen where you actually input all your to-do information can be a Flutter app. This is cool. It's great. I don't recommend it, nor have I ever recommended it to customers to go full production with. That's my opinion. And I feel that, what you end up with is kind of this clunky hybrid model where you have you're still using the entire tool chain. You're opening up Android Studio, you're opening up Xcode, you're still working on your existing code base, and then you're also working on Flutter and the Flutter code base. I think that's, while I think that is fine and acceptable, I don't think it's a great model for long-term development, which is why I typically avoid it. However, you'll notice in the next 5 strategies that I have, we still do use a very hybrid model, but in a much more elegant and smarter way that provides scalability and robustness. So lots of buzzwords there, but let's figure out what I mean. Actually, before that, I want to show you how quick it is to add to app to your application if you do want to do it. Here's a GIF that I went online and I got from the Flutter website. And you can see that they open up Android Studio, they create a new module, and then they start a new activity and they start a Flutter engine. And then they click launch and there we go. It's working, right? It's straightforward. Again, like I said, I don't recommend it for production apps. It's great to kind of prototype your Flutter app. Great to even push out your app to a small set of users to show, cool ideas and prototypes that you're doing. But when it does come time to go full on, we're going to push our app to 1 million users, I recommend you follow my 5 steps. So what are my 5 steps that I keep talking about? Step number 1, audit your dependencies. The first thing you should do when you're thinking of migrating your application is go through your Gradle or your CocoaPods. I'm going to talk about Android more because I've just been an Android developer for so long. But go through your Gradle file and line by line look at your dependencies, right? You might have Picasso, Dagger, whatever the cool kids are using for Android these days. And then you might have some other very interesting dependencies. For example, you might have a library called Radar, which helps you find users nearby. And you might go, okay, well, let's go find the replacement of Picasso on Flutter. So you go to pub.dev, and for those that don't know, pub.dev is like the NPM of the Dart world or Flutter world. You can find tons of libraries there. So you go to pub.dev and you type in Picasso or you type in image cache and you find something, and great. In your checklist, write down, awesome, I have found a replacement for Picasso. And then you might run into something like Radar, like I previously mentioned. And you look at Radar, you're like, wait a minute, there's no replacement for Radar on pub. Like, no one's ever built this Radar library. Does that mean I can't build my Flutter app anymore? No. What it means is you're gonna have to do a bit more work, but I can promise you that it's worth it. What you have to do is build something called a plugin. A Flutter plugin is basically a way for you to call some Dart code or Flutter code in your app, but what that code does is it actually talks to the Android and iOS world. Technically, this is how Flutter works on its own, right? If Flutter needs to make a call to the GPS, Flutter doesn't actually have code that connects to some C++ low-level GPS, communicates with like some satellite flying around. What it does is it just uses the code that's already there, built into the operating system. It says, hey Android, hey iOS, invoke your GPS sensor, give me some information. This lets Flutter be very scalable. In your case, or in our case, we have this library called Radar, this hypothetical library. So what we would do is we would take our Radar code that we've written, this business logic that we already have, and we would create a Flutter plugin out of it so that our Flutter app can call our already existing Radar code. How do we do that? Well, before we get to how we do that, this is how the architecture looks, but we'll come back to that. So how do we call, I'm gonna move myself slightly here, perfect. And let's shrink myself, you don't need to see me so big. So on your Flutter app, you would say something like channel.invoke method, call Radar code. In your Java app, you would override a method called onMethodCall, and all you would do in that method is you would say, hey, did someone call Radar code, right? If my Flutter app called it, then call my entire Java Radar code here and return a value. The beauty about this is it's asynchronous and it's also synchronous. So you can decide if your library is asynchronous, if it's using async task or whatever is used now on Android. I haven't done Android development in like a year and a half. But I know async tasks are not recommended anymore. But if you do need to call an async task, technically you can call it here. And then on the post UI thread, you can then return result.success. Stuff like that you can do, and what it does is it lets you be more flexible. If you find a plugin in your dependency list that doesn't exist, make a plugin out of it. And what's amazing about this is if your plugin, if you feel generous, and I do hope that you do, you can actually submit that plugin back to pub.dev for other developers to use. So I think just doing that, ask the community, and then it's just this pay it forward where developers helping developers. It's great. How do plugins actually work at a concept level? You have the framework in Dart, you have material widget sets, you have the rendering, all the animation, painting, gestures, and then you have services and plugins. And then what it's calling at the bottom is platform-specific code. And what platform-specific code is code written specifically for Android or written specifically for iOS. There's all sorts of hooks there, right? If the Dart VM is running on Android, it's doing some certain things. If it's running on iOS, it's also doing other iOS-specific things. And so services, that red layer, lets you talk to that entire blue box, the platform-specific world. And then specifically, I'm saying specific so many times, you can actually go to the Android or iOS world hooks. So you're not just limited by GPS. You can call like the contact address book. You can call the vibrator on Android. You can go crazy and, if tomorrow Samsung comes out with the tongue sensor where you unlock your phone by sticking your tongue on it, you can actually call that from your Flutter app and it'll just work. So that's the power of a plugin. And so let's extend that. My step 2 is, or strategy 2 is to encapsulate your business logic. So what does that mean? Imagine you're building a music player, and this music player has this shuffle algorithm. For those that are old enough, when iTunes first came out, they had an issue that people thought the shuffle was broken on iTunes because it would play a song and then like 10 minutes later would play the same song again. And so people complained, and Steve Jobs got the entire team on iTunes to rewrite the shuffle algorithm so it was not random anymore, but it was less random, but it seemed more random. And so imagine your music player has a quantum, taking into account quantum randomness, comes up with a cool random algorithm. Now it's time for you to port that to Flutter. It's 600 lines long. Do you really want to port that? What about bugs? Do you have the right unit testing? And so what you can do is you can wrap that business logic in a plugin. Just like what we did with the radar code, you can do the exact same thing. So let me show you visually what I mean. Right? So let's go here and let's say that we have an Android app here. Let's just make the background a bit white. Cool. So say we have our, oops. Oh, there we go. What happened here? All right. So we got our Android, iOS, music app. Clearly I can't type. Music app. Cool. And then this music app ties into this quantum random shuffle algorithm. So far, so good. And this algorithm is written in, say, Kotlin, and it's also written in Swift on iOS. Great. And so you got these two things here. Now, you start to rewrite your app in Flutter. So now you have your Flutter music app. Flutter music app. And you still have this quantum shuffle algorithm. And remember, this is like 800 lines of code. This is a lot of code for this one algorithm. So you have two choices. You can go and rewrite this 800 lines of code in Dart, which is probably in the long run a good idea, and I do recommend that in the long run. However, you want to minimize your risk. You are already porting over an entire application. Do you really want to port over all this core business logic that is so important to your app that if your app fails at it, people are gonna give you a 1 star? So what you could do is you can wrap it in a plugin, just like what we talked about. So you can introduce this middle layer here, and you can call this, say, algorithms.dart. Algorithms.dart. And what algorithms.dart does is it calls a platform-specific code, platform-specific method, and it calls the quantum shuffle on Kotlin and Swift. And in returns, that returns back to algorithms.dart, and then algorithms.dart returns back to your Flutter music app, and you have a UI updating. If I go up here, all you're calling is the exact same code or the style of code that I've written here. You're going channel.invoke method, and instead of saying call radar code, maybe you write quantum code. And then in your on method call in your Kotlin or Java, you would say call.method equals Kotlin code. And then here, where it says call my radar dependency code here, you would call your quantum algorithm. You would pass in the right parameters, maybe it's the last 10 songs, whatever, and then you would return the next song to play. The beauty about this is your code and your business logic is untouched. If your code worked previously, it will work now. All you're doing is you're adding a layer on top that encapsulates your business logic in a plugin. This will help you move faster and develop your application faster. And then in the long run, what you could do is once your application launched, you can start to think about, well, okay, our application's launched, we've gotten rid of, but we've de-risked our application, right? The UI is working great, the ratings are good, all the other features are working great. Now it's time to take our core business logic and rewrite that now to Dart, right? We're now not dealing with 10 fires, we're only dealing with one fire, and we're just going to put it out by rewriting it into Dart. So that's a very, very powerful use case for plugins. And I do recommend you always write a plugin when you have some really complicated business logic, especially when there's business logic that has like years of debt and years of hidden layers and knowledge to it. It's always hard to just rewrite that in a new language and hope that it's going to work perfectly fine, even with unit tests, because maybe your unit tests aren't covering the entire spectrum, and there's all these hidden cases that are working that you haven't taken into account. So moving forward, you've done that, your application is looking great. Does that mean you can launch your application? Absolutely not. I got called into an application, a migration a migration client, about 95% of the way done. And the client called me up, said, can you just come in? It's like 2 weeks worth of work. We just need someone to do some code review and push up the app. I said, all right, sounds good, easy money. I come in and I'm testing the app, and I realized that whenever I have the old Play Store version and I upgrade to the new Flutter version, it doesn't quite work. My app's not upgraded. It turns out that the team, being super smart, overlooked this one part about user migration. And it's very easy to overlook this part because you're building in a simulator, you're building on Android emulator, and you're always running a fresh version of your app. And so the first thing they did was they installed Hive, which is a library for Flutter, and they built out the user model in Hive. And everything was working great, and they were very excited that, hey, our login's working, they're authenticating with their own backend, everything's working fine. But when I started doing upgrade testing, it didn't quite work. And so what we had to do was we had to go back and we had to figure out how we're going to grab all the credentials, the entire upgrade, the user model from the old app to the new one. And I suggested what I'm suggesting here. Let's build a plugin. We did the exact same thing. We built another Flutter plugin, and all that plugin did was it grabbed from Android. It did like a select everything from user table, from points table, grabbed all that data and pushed it up one layer up to the Flutter world. And then what we did there is then we wrote a script, or we wrote like a class, and then that algorithm inserted everything into Hive, which was the database they were using for Flutter. This way, they were able to upgrade easily, and me catching that just helped them avoid this chaos that could have happened if they were to push this out to 1 million users, and 1 million users suddenly had to log out. Sometimes it's death for a business. I know Twitter, when Twitter accidentally logged out like almost all their users, it took them months to come back. In fact, they even had that on their earnings call where they said, because of a bug, we estimate usage to be lower because people haven't logged back in. So think about that. Another story, I was called by the head of e-commerce at this other company, and they're like, hey, no one's buying this app, Flutter sucks, it looks like it's not working. And they was jumping to conclusions. They usually make 100K a day, so rightfully so, they're very frustrated. Like our charts are saying 0 revenue all day. I start freaking out. This has nothing to do with Flutter, but I'm trying to understand what happened. I tested, we wrote unit tests for the purchase path. I don't understand. I even bought $10 worth of stuff after we launched the app, so how could it show 0 sales? It turns out that the analytics funnel that they were looking at inside of Looker expected that the user to go to screen A, screen B, screen C, and then purchase. Yes, the user optically is doing the same thing on the new Flutter app, but on Android it was activity 1, activity 2, activity 3, activity 4, purchase. On Flutter, there's no concept of activities. We have routes, and then even the way this app was built, it was actually consolidating a couple different activities into one using visibility and a couple other page list view techniques. And so for that reason, the actual funnel broke for Google Analytics. And so what we had to do was explain this to the stakeholder and say, listen, your purchases are all showing up. Look at Stripe and look at Google in-app purchase or whatever. However, we now have to make an annotation inside of Looker saying on this day we pushed out a new build that changed how the flows worked, and we had to build out all these new funnels. So plan for this, because a lot of times people get tripped over and they have these complex analytics funnels and stuff, and then they get an alert the next day after they push out a build saying user for example, user likes are 30% down. It's because it's not the same way. The way you're tracking likes on a native Android app versus on a native Flutter app, you might have built it differently just because of the architecture of the app, and so your analytics flow is completely screwed up. So that's something major you have to think to keep into account. Lastly, but not the least, is probably the most important, is do the UI last. I know a lot of developers, they just jump on, they go, okay, cool. The app, it's so easy, designing the UI is so easy in Flutter, I'm just gonna quickly prototype something, show the stakeholder, everyone's happy, and we're gonna just push out the app. And then they realize, well, we have to now do the business logic. Now we got to do this. Now we got to do that. And that changes some of the stuff on the way they did their UI. So what I recommend is always do the UI at the end. In fact, what I strongly recommend is, this is point number 5. I recommend you take a week per point, right? Take a week for doing your due diligence for your dependencies. Take a week in doing user migration. Take a week for doing analytics migration. Take another week for doing your business logic encapsulation. And then during that time, tell your design team, hey, design team, think about, we're moving to Flutter. Now you can actually come up with all sorts of cool animations, because Flutter has 60 frames per second, tons of cool animations built in that we can do easily. Think about how we can add polish to our existing app. And then you have 4 weeks to do it. In those 4 weeks, we're going to build out the plumbing, all the different layers. And then on the 5th week, go back to your design team and say, okay, show us what you have, and implement that last layer, which is the UI layer. Now, it might take you a week, it might take you 3 weeks, depending on how complicated your application is. But my point is, do the UI at the end. It's never a bottleneck. I've never run across a team doing a migration that says, well, shoot, the UI is why we're so late. It's never that. They're always saying, well, it's because we forgot about analytics migration. Now we're delayed by 2 weeks. We forgot about user migration. We're delayed by 3 weeks. We forgot about, the business logic we rewrote in Dart is broken because we forgot about these subtle edge cases because unit testing wasn't covering. And it just kept getting delayed and delayed. And the UI is usually the first to finish. So do the UI at the end. Spent a lot of time on the other options. So let's recap. Add to app, I recommend only for prototyping. Audit your dependencies, encapsulate your business logic, think about user migration, super important, analytics migration, and then lastly, UI development. If you follow these 5 steps, I can guarantee that you will have an easier time for migrating your Android and iOS app to Flutter. With that, thank you. My Twitter handle is Faisal Abid, and my email is faisal.abid@gmail.com. Feel free to email me, ask me any questions. I'm happy to help anytime. Thank you.